Aloha, I'm Joshua Cooper, and I was fortunate enough to be part of the U.S. Human Rights Network program focusing on the Universal Periodic Review. We were focusing on the UPR for roughly 18 months. We began last summer by looking at what other countries have done, but more importantly, to reinvigorate and examine new ways that civil society could change the dynamics and more importantly, be more involved in the process. The first thing we did was actually having conference calls across the country from each community sharing what they felt were the most important human rights issues. From there, we were able to figure out what were the giant themes that had to be discussed that couldn't be ignored when the US was going to come before the UPR in this historic process. What we were able to do then was be able to organize from May through November to really identify the core issues that we would raise. From there, we were able to then come up with these cluster reports. The cluster reports ended up being 25 different themes that were very important for people to be raised here at the Universal Periodic Review. We're able to then break into these cluster reports, and by November, we began the writing process and the drafting process. Another important feature that did happen while we were working on writing these cluster reports to be due in April was the government decided to have meetings and to do a listening tour. We were able to mobilize ourselves to make sure that the listening tour included the most important cities, starting off with Katrina and going around the US to over a dozen different places, wrapping up with meetings in Washington, D.C. that allowed civil society to speak directly to the government. So in the end, on April, we turned in 25 themed reports covering a variety of issues that were significant to civil society. But we also then were allowed to do specific reports from our NGOs that were more succinct, and also do an overall report that shows our dedication and, more importantly, our ability to unify, to speak with one voice. We had a meeting in Washington, D.C. that was a national workshop. There we actually had an all-day session with NGOs, but also allowed other NGOs not in Washington, D.C. to call in. And we went through the 25 theme reports, but broke them down into the main issue, the main questions, and the main recommendations. In a way, we got them into advocacy sheets. From there, we came to Geneva. We did a training with CIFIDOP, the International Training Center for Teaching Peace and Human Rights, and EIP, École Instrument de la Paix, and we did a training with them to include U.S. civil society with other civil society that have been through the UPR and that are also involved at the same time as us in November. So this training was very important to get people working on the ground in New York City and in the Deep South to be able to see what the Geneva mechanism was like. We also did our first side event in June last year to then be able to share the information. From there, we were able to mobilize to make sure that at the September session, we came with a good delegation of roughly 12 people. This dynamic dozen was able to organize over 60 meetings with governments in the Serpentine as well as upstairs in the meeting room to make sure that all of the issues that were raised in our cluster theme reports were brought forward and put into the hands of the most important people. One important tool that allowed us to do this effectively was the UPR info. We took the information from that and then matched up the countries with the issues, and that allowed us to focus and work better to make sure that the right countries were going to get the right information, and more importantly, would be inclined to raise the points as they had done in the past at previous UPR sessions. One final thing that we did on our way back from Geneva is we had a meeting with ambassadors in Washington, D.C. At the American University, we invited ambassadors to come and talk with us about issues they might want to share. So we had a great meeting on that Friday, returning from the Human Rights Council, to meet with them and talk in the country to give them the issues and recommendations one more time. This then really laid the framework to allow us to come to Geneva and do what we did that we thought was at an unprecedented level of bringing over 60 NGOs from all over the US, from Hawaii all the way to Washington, D.C., to talk about important issues from self-determination to social justice, healthcare, to housing, and to make sure that we actually listen to each other and learn from one another. I think we did this very well in that we had over a dozen side events. And at each side event, we had two basic ways to coordinate. One was to do an overview of the most significant issues, but two, have deep discussions on specific issues that allow people to understand the complexity of what's happening in our country. We were able to organize these and meet with governments, but also meet with other civil society to share our story and move forward of what needs to be done next. We had a film festival. This was very important because it allowed us to share videos from the people who couldn't come to Geneva. One way to break the mold was we had civil society make short films and put up on YouTube, and we called it the Testify Project. With the Testify Project, people could make a 2-minute video that said what was wrong or a human rights issue, and more importantly, what should be done and how they recommended positive changes. This is what they were able to do and how they were able to organize that. The Testify Project, then we had a winner. One of the winners was able to come to Geneva and speak for themselves and share their story. It was the farm workers from Florida. Then, of course, came up to the big day. We're actually pleased with that. We were able to get, as people know now, 228 recommendations. And what's really important is the recommendations were really the voice of civil society in the US speaking through the states. All of our efforts of lobbying and working with resulted in these recommendations. I think creativity is at the foundation of our work and what definitely is an example of our best practices. I think one of the most important was social networking and using alternative media. One important one was actually organizing and doing the Testify Project that allowed everyday people just to pick up any camera and be able to record their position. They didn't have to be attorneys, they didn't have to be advocates with decades of experience. They could actually just look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and point out what was not happening in their communities in the United States. This resulted in over 50 different people sending their perspectives of what needs to be done and how the US could improve. I also believe it's important to have events that get us out of the daily grind of the Palais des Nations. The events in the evening, we had our own reception. So it wasn't just that the government had a reception, we had our own reception that allowed all the NGOs to come together and meet. Some of the people in the United States had never met face to face. In fact, we only knew each other via telephone calls. So it was actually a chance to meet the people you've worked with for over a year. And that turned out really amazing. The other, though, was the Epilogue Human Rights House Party. And that was amazing in that NGOs, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, government delegations, and other civil society came together in an informal setting. We were able to watch films for 2 hours made by the US NGOs. And then we also had an informal panel where people could just talk briefly about some of the important issues that they felt need to be addressed with the UPR. But one thing that I think was even the best thing, though, was the town hall. The town hall, in a way, was a UPR for civil society. The government would present, but more importantly, civil society would be able to ask and pose their questions and recommendations. And it was actually more interactive and dynamic than the actual UPR upstairs. So many people were pleased with this. They also brought in Washington, D.C., so Washington, D.C. was there, as well as civil society in D.C. So I would suggest other countries would be able to have something along these lines. This was an improvement from what had happened with Switzerland with a joint press conference and Mexico with an informal meeting. I think this shows some examples of how we can all learn from each other and make this UPR more dynamic, especially with the review coming up. We can't allow it to retreat. We must actually revolutionize the process to engage and be more effective in this process. One of the greatest challenges we faced, of course, was a midterm election. This, of course, was nothing that we could really control, but it did frame in many ways some of the backlash that could happen back home when dealing with conservatives in the US. I think one of the most important things was for us to lobby countries and try to make sure that the questions that were raised and the recommendations that were made were the voice of civil society and not only political rhetoric from states that had an axe to grind with our government. We, I think, are the most critical voices in the US of what is wrong, and we don't want civil society to become in a way, a political tool of other countries. And this was the difficult part, to be able to bring your questions forward and to make sure that governments had the interests of the people and not only their own foreign policy. This is one of the problems of the UPR, in that it is political and not experts that ask these questions. You know, we did our best to be able to organize around that. We knew no matter what happened, certain negative media would grab this and put it with their own perspective. It was interesting when you actually see Fox News targeting human rights defenders and challenging human rights defenders as opposed to actually speaking and using that space to share these important issues around human rights. But I'd say this was probably the biggest challenge that we had to face. The other is media in general. How do you summarize 18 months of work into a one-page press release? This was definitely a challenge, but if you start looking at the media that's coming out now, I think it was a good beginning. and more importantly, it'll allow us to build on that for March for the official adoption. So media work is definitely important, as well as advocacy with countries. But overall, I think we did an amazing job to be able to educate the countries and explain to them why the questions and recommendations were important for the people back home in the United States and the communities.